All right, today is Chapter 3, The British Atlantic World, 1660 to 1750. Now, we're going to kind of talk about some of the different colonial regions, some of the things, but I want to jump all the way to the very last slide and kind of set you up for where we're going with this. Right there at the bottom, it says Britain vowed to reassert their power in America. Okay, so we're going through this time. America and the colonies are definitely changing. Who's in them, how they're getting there, the economics, the diversity of them with slavery and different things. And by the end of this chapter, you're going to see Britain's kind of starting to lose hold on the colonies, and so they're going to be refocused and reemphasized to control them even more. So we have the Carolinas. It's a proprietorship, which our grantees owned all the land, could rule as they wished, but the laws had to conform to those in England. Okay, you had a manorial system, serfs and nobles and different things, so a hierarchy of different structures and different ranks of people. You had runaway servants and Quakers who didn't want to work on large manors, rebelled over taxes, were tended to be there. And you're going to see this is definitely going to change. The Carolinas are going to be huge slave locations later on. South Carolina used slaves, Africans and Native Americans, and by 1740, 2/3 of the population in the Carolinas was black, was African. William Penn, that's where we get the name Pennsylvania from, the state. His colony was all about unity of purpose and refuge for Quakers. Quakers were a type of religion that he was a part of, and so he wanted a place for them to be able to go. He was also huge into sharing with Native Americans, making treaties and agreements with them and working together with them. And he also wanted religious freedom within his colonies, cheap land, and ethnic diversity. Now we have this idea of mercantilism and imperial dominion. We'll kind of go over those more in just a minute, but we have this thing called the Navigation Acts. It's a law that the British Parliament enforced on the colonies. And remember or know from American history, these laws and different things that Britain imposes on the colonies are going to lead to the Declaration of Independence and ultimately the Revolutionary War. So goods, so items, must be carried on English ships and colonial merchants. They banned foreign traders and this Massachusetts Bay Colony. The laws of England are bound within the seas and do not reach America was kind of some of their protest to this. The colonies were not liking this, even though this was the law and the rule that they followed for quite a while. You have the Dominion of New England. King James II, he comes in with a heavy hand, abolishes or gets rid of the existing legislative assemblies, cancels town meetings, requires the Church of England, and different things. And there in green on that little map, you can see his power and authority there. You have this idea called the Glorious Revolution. The Glorious Revolution is basically the coup of King James II, and he's being replaced by King William of Orange. And it's bloodless, it's pretty simple and straightforward, so King James II is no longer king. A lot of the reasoning behind this idea were some political parties and political groups in England wanting a change. But there was also a philosopher named John Locke who wrote a book called Two Treatises on Government in 1690 that kind of led to this philosophy and this thinking. Basically, the legitimacy, John Locke said, the legitimacy of government rests on the consent of the governed and that individuals have inalienable natural rights to life, liberty, and property. Those of you familiar with some of the founding documents of our country, that will sound familiar. And in response to this glorious revolution over in England, change of power, there were some rebellions in America. Americans started to rebel and started to kind of gain back and influence some of their own rights again. One thing with this expansion of Europeans, specifically Europeans, but other wider countries as well, is you start to run into Native Americans. And as there's more war and more conflict, you're going to get into this thing called tribalization, where you're going to have very specific tribes or groups of Native Americans kind of banding together to support one another, or banding together to support other countries. You know, maybe the Indians support the French, or this Native American group supports the Spanish, and different things to be able to um, to fight off their enemies and overcome other groups and other people and different things. You also have massive diseases coming in from the Europeans coming into the Native Americans. And these diseases are very influential or very deadly to the old and the young within the Native American groups. You have the South Atlantic system, which sets up sugar as the primary product within the like the Caribbean, modern day Caribbean, kind of some of those islands and different things. Slave trade is huge in the West Indies. They have a large English population, and after 1650, sugar transformed these islands into slave-based plantation societies. Before, they were very small, still predominantly English controlled, but they were small farms and different things. But with the introduction of slavery and different things, it definitely led to some major changes. Eventually, they started to have some problems in the West Indies, and so many of the English large farmers moved to South Carolina and brought with them their slaves. The South Atlantic system brought wealth to the entire British and European economy and helped Europeans achieve world economic leadership. Once again, we have those Navigation Acts, which are laws and rules about who can trade with who and different things. Sugar and slaves are going to lead to enormous profits. And if you can see over there on that chart, it's the number of Africans arriving alive in the Americas and Europe. And approximately 14% died on these slave ships. By 1790, British ships were carrying 300 to 350 slaves and were leaving Africa at least every other day. That's a lot of slaves being shipped out. Africans in the slave trade, warfare and slaving was not new. This idea of in Africa of fighting your neighbor or fighting your enemy and taking them as possessions was not new. They had been doing this for a long, long time. 2/3 of the slaves that were being sent out of Africa were men. They could gain more money and get more profit. And the Middle Passage basically consisted of a few different components. One, or the first part of this Middle Passage, you would march from your village to the port in chains as captive. You would be loaded on a boat that would be overcrowded, just complete filthiness, complete disgusting, and then would head over to the plantations. Now, slavery in the Chesapeake region is like Maryland, Virginia, like modern-day Washington, D.C. area, and then also South Carolina. By 1720, Africans were 20% of the population in the Chesapeake area. By 1740, it had gone up to 40%. Laws were starting to protect the institution of slavery, and tobacco slaves lived longer than sugar slaves. The weather conditions and the type of product that they were growing on tobacco plantations was a little bit easier than sugar slaves, and so they would last longer. By 1710, Africans made up 80% of South Carolina's population, specifically in the rice growing areas. Now, within these predominantly slave areas, these slaves were still trying to keep some sense of normalcy with community and different things, kind of family lives. Marriage wasn't legal, and so they would just kind of have common law marriages or common understanding marriages where male and female would get married and have children. They tried to keep some cultural identities. They tried to keep some of their hairstyles and some of their wood carvings and poetry and some of their musical instruments, some of that style, and even some religion. The philosophies and ideas of Muslims were passed down amongst some slaves. And it was obviously illegal to teach slaves how to read and write. And this whole idea of institution, it was all around fear. Fear that the white man or the leader, whoever it would be, would cause fear and harm amongst the slaves, and so they complied based out of fear. There were some, though, that would run away or rise up in rebellion. We have the Stoner Rebellion. It was successful in a small regard. The idea of these slaves rising up and killing their white masters and white people around them happened, not very often, not very ultimately successfully, but it did, enough so that many of the slave owners were afraid of this. Now, you have the urban economy and urban society. That word urban, we live in an urban environment right now here in Las Vegas, okay? We're not out in the country. We don't have large tracts of land. You know, we each have our own little property, whatever that may consist of, and that's kind of it for us. By 1750s, 2/3 of New England's exports and half of the middle colonies went to British and French sugar islands. So despite us not being able to trade, we were still doing a lot of trading with other places besides just England. With the urban economy by the 1730s, there were 1,500 transatlantic voyages. So items coming from Europe and from Africa to America and vice versa, and moving them all around. By 1776, the city of Philadelphia had over 30,000 people. So we started to have some larger communities and larger locations. We had the urban society, so we have the rich, we have the mansions and their furniture and their fancy dinners. But we also start to understand more and recognize more of the socioeconomic statuses, high, middle, and low class type thing. Now, we have the rise of colonial assemblies. Colonial assemblies are kind of like government groups within the colonies. Okay, they took control of taxation and appointments. Only men of wealth and status were able to hold these political positions, and they were responsive to popular pressure and resistance to British control. In the book, it mentions a couple different stories where they would pass a tax. For one, there was like if you were a farmer and you wanted to sell your product, you had to sell it at this one market. Well, they went and burned down the market and said that's not fair. We want to be able to sell it wherever. So these colonial assemblies kind of changed their tune based on the pressure that the people were putting on them. You have salutary neglect, which definition is relaxing supervision of eternal colonial affairs. Royal bureaucrats inadvertently assisted the rise of self-government in North America. Basically, England was going to kind of take a hands-off approach. Hey, let's kind of just work them. We're still getting all the power and money from them, but let's kind of let them do their own thing, and that ultimately ended up backfiring on them. Then you have mercantilism and the American colonies. So mercantilism, a definition, is a system of political economy based on government regulation. And beginning in 1650, Britain enacted navigation acts that controlled colonial commerce and manufacturing for the enrichment of Britain. American merchants were basically 75% in charge of all manufacturing commerce that was going across the ocean, and 95%, manufacturing. So 75% of all manufactured items were controlled by America, and 95% of the commerce. So America has a huge, or these original colonies have a huge impact economically and goods-wise on what is going around the world, despite not being their own independent country and still being controlled by Britain. And so just as we started, Britain vowed to reassert their power in America. America and these colonies had too much power, and Britain was starting to say, oh my goodness, we can't lose them, we need them, and so what are we going to do to keep them around? And that is it for today.